the working class, the left, we need to present an alternative to the neoliberal imperialist integration of the NAFTA and the isolationist, imperialist, chauvinistic approach of Donald Trump. Because what is true is that our working class, from Canada to Central America, Oden, we are connected by the value chains. We are the engines, we're the fuel, we're the heart that makes this big value change moving.
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. In his presidential inauguration speech 3 weeks ago, Donald Trump declared, "The golden age of America begins right now." A big part of this vision is his hawkish, expansionist, imperialist agenda. And a major target of this agenda is Latin America. As we've talked about before, the U.S. is facing growing economic and political crises and overall declining U.S. hegemony. It's in this context that the Trump administration needs to subordinate Latin American countries to the interests of U.S. capital by, for example, extracting more resources, exploiting these countries' huge working classes. Another important piece of this context, of course, is the growing threat of China to U.S. power and China's increasing encroachment in Latin America, an area of the world that the U.S. has often called its backyard. A lot has happened in the few weeks that Trump has been president, but in particular, we've seen this imperialist agenda in action. So, for example, Trump used the threat of 25% tariffs on both Mexico and Canada to basically force both countries to ramp up their military presence at their borders. Mexico, for example, has promised 10,000 troops to the border. Trump has also spoken about trying to retake the Panama Canal. He's revoked temporary protective status for Venezuelans living in the U.S., and so far, he's ordered over 1,500 troops to the U.S. border. Also, his attacks on migrants, including having raids by Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, are in full force. He's even started to send migrants to Guantanamo Bay. Another telling sign of Trump's imperialist agenda, by the way, is that Marco Rubio's first trip as Secretary of State was to Central America. On this episode, we're focusing on Mexico, which has perhaps the most important role to play in terms of shoring up the US's economic and political interests in this coming period. Let me just put the U.S. Mexico relationship into context. So, Mexico is the largest single country provider of U.S. imports. Last year, around 800 billion worth of goods were transported across the border. And to put that number into context, this makes the US-Mexico border just below one of the world's 20 largest economies. US and Mexican manufacturing in particular are intimately connected, especially the automotive industry. It's really no exaggeration to say that the US-Mexico relationship has profoundly shaped the working classes, economies, and politics of both countries. To discuss this, I'm joined by Jimena Vergara. Jimena is an editor here at Left Voice. She's also a former professor at UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and she's the co-author of 3 books on Mexican history published in Spanish. Jimena explains how Mexico's relationship with the US is fundamentally one of subordination. She describes how important this relationship has been to the country's economies and to U.S. imperialism, and she explains the effect of the war on drugs on Mexico's militarization and the working class. We also discuss the role that Mexico and Latin America more broadly will play under the Trump administration. Most importantly, we talk about what's necessary to win true liberation for the Mexican and U.S. working classes. As Jimena highlights, this means not having illusions in the governing MORENA party, including in former President AMLO, nor in the current president, Claudia Sheinbaum. Neither of them represents a break with imperialism or capitalism, or with Mexico's subordination to US interests. Here in the US, liberation means not having illusions in a Democratic Party, which offers nothing to the working class of either country, and which has, like the Republican Party, worked to develop the US's deeply exploitative relationship with Mexico. Instead, what we emphasize in this episode is that we need internationalism. We need unity between the Mexican and US working class. So, here in the US, even just in the past few weeks, we've already seen resistance to, for example, ICE raids and Trump's deportations. People are rising up to say that immigrants are not a cause of our social and economic problems, whether here or in Latin America. On both sides of the border, we need to unite our struggles to defeat the far right and Trump and his racist, chauvinist, xenophobic agenda. Just a quick note for context, given how quickly things are moving in the news. I am recording this on Wednesday, February 5th, and Jimena and I recorded this conversation before Trump's calls with Claudia Sheinbaum and Canadian President Justin Trudeau, which led to a at least 1 month postponement of the proposed tariffs. If you want to support Left Voice, that would be wonderful. You can go to patreon.com/leftvoice. It also helps to leave us a nice little 5-star review on podcast platforms. And of course, you should follow us on social media where we use the handle left_voice. Here's my interview with Jimena. Jimena, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, everyone. How are you doing, Oden? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, long-time listener, first-time caller, as they say. Yeah, really excited to talk to you today about, in particular, Donald Trump and what the presidency is going to mean for Mexico and Latin America. But I think it would be useful to start by characterizing the current situation, especially because, although, of course, Trump is talking a lot about Mexico, the border, etc., Mexico's importance to the US is nothing new. So, how would you describe the US Mexico relationship? And what role does Mexico play in US imperialism?
Yeah, so it's a very important and interesting question. As you know, Mexico, Canada, and the United States have been part of the free trade agreement since 1994. First the NAFTA and then the USMCA. And it's an agreement that, even though it was presented as an agreement between equal countries, right? The truth is that Mexico has a relationship with the United States that is the relationship of a semi-colony. There is a lot of semi-colonial or colonial features on the relationship between the US, which is the most important power in the world still. Its hegemony, it's in crisis worldwide, but is still the most powerful power in the world. So the relationship with Mexico has been always in terms of subordination, okay, in terms of US corporations exploiting the resources and the labor force of Mexico in conditions that are incredibly beneficial for US capital and US corporations, right? So that's why Mexico is becoming one of the most important commercial partners of the US internationally, right? So I brought up the free agreement because this relationship was shaped by the agreement. This relationship has been always the case, like Mexico is a semi colony of the United States. But at the same time, the NAFTA and then the USMCA shaped this relationship in a very particular way because the three economies were transformed by the free trade. But not only the economies, the legislations, right? The politics. And from below, of course, it changed a lot the face of the American working class and the Mexican working class that grew and expanded. It spread out the country with the industrial boom created by the intense foreign investment of like US corporations in the border, etc. Okay, so at this point, Mexico, Canada, and the United States share an economy that is in many ways symbiotic, right? Although is not a relationship between equal partners under any circumstance, right? Because the US plays a very intense imperialist role over Mexico. And what are these like changes, structural changes that we saw created and shaped by the consequences of the free trade? It was on the one hand an industry that is extremely dependent on US trade and US industry. For example, in the case of manufacturing, Mexico became, along China, a very important niche of cheap labor, right? Where the industries, for example, the auto industry, that was incredibly prominent in America after the Second World War and until the 70s and the 80s, right? The industry was relocated towards Mexico, especially the north of Mexico, the states that are like part of the northern border of Mexico, Chihuahua, Sonora, Baja California. All those states were kind of like invaded, right, by the what we call in Mexico the maquiladora industry. And the maquiladoras are and were factories, mill-sized big factories that manufacture for mostly US corporations, very important components of like cars, but not exclusively. Mexico and the United States have one of the most important value chains in the world, and the auto industry is part of it, but not exclusively. So this penetration, this imperialist penetration, created the new Mexican working class within the last, I don't know, 25 years. Okay, so Mexico and China played that very important role for U.S. economy, and of course for their own economy. It brought like huge consequences. So the other aspect that reshaped Mexico due to the intense imperialist penetration facilitated by the agreement was in terms of agriculture. The Mexican agriculture, thanks to the agreement, collapsed because all the US products that were like invading the market, the Mexican market, were more accessible, were cheaper, and the Mexican products, the Mexican countryside, it was not and is not as developed as the United States countryside. So the peasants, very poor peasants, or small landowners, were dispossessed by like a very direct process of dispossession with the US corporations ahead, or they were obligated to sell their like lands and to migrate to the United States because they didn't have a way to improve their living conditions. They were left in poverty. And for example, in the case of very basic products of the Mexican countryside, which is corn, right? Corn is, as you know, very important in Mexico culture. We love it. We cook tortillas and all that. No, but it's incredibly important for our diet, incredibly important for the diet of the indigenous people, of the peasantry, but in general, and the working class. We used to have a very diverse industry of the corn because we have more than 60 kind of corns in Mexico. Anyway, the American corn, which is transgenic, invaded the the industry, and now the Mexican corn is struggling to survive, you know, and of course is already contaminated by
Yeah.
genetically modified corn, right? So that, but that's a small example. It shaped the countryside, and due to the crisis of the industry of the agriculture, but not exclusively, of course, violence and questions that we're going to develop later, thousands and dozens of thousands of human beings from the countryside had to migrate to the cities, to the industries, for example, to the maquiladora industry. Hundreds and hundreds of women, very young indigenous women or peasant women, migrated to the cities of the north of Mexico, where the industry was like proliferating and they were able to get jobs and to send money to their families. But some of them had to cross the border, and they are part of the American working class because they came and they work here and they pay taxes and they are part of the labor force. The problem is that they are part of the labor force without rights. And that explains a lot of the kind of migration that we have in the United States, right? So the agreement reshaped also the agriculture. And the agreement also had implications in relationship with the laws that Mexico put forward, the government of the PRI on those days, because the labor law became subordinated to the agreement, and the US needed a labor law that allowed them to have an organized cheap labor force with no unions, led by business unionism or unexistent unionism for years. So it's a very precarious labor force, the Mexican industrial labor force. So the laws were subordinated to that. And then the agreement included, of course, an aspect of national security, right? And this is very important because historically the US imposed into Mexico an approach on drugs that is based on criminalization. It's based on criminalization, which means that you need a repressive apparatus because you're criminalizing drugs. So you have this approach that you need military, you need police, you need to, as if the drug problem was a problem of security, of national security. The truth is that it's a public health problem, right? But they always approach that issue. But in the 70s, even the 80s, Mexico was, of course, producing marijuana and other drugs, but it was most of all, the cartels in Mexico were most of all distributors of the drugs that were coming from Colombia. And that changed in Mexico with the agreement with neoliberalism. And Mexico started to produce its own drugs, not only marijuana, but also coke, the amapola flower, we call it in Mexico for cocaine and heroin and other drugs. And then they started producing fentanyl. So the US strengthened this approach and suggested the militarization of the country that started in 2000 with the new government, with the PAN government, which was the first government after more than 70 years of one single party government. Okay, it was the democratic transition. So this new party had to carry on these requirements that the White House was imposing into Mexico to control the drug problem. Okay,
And from the White House perspective, this is what they called the war on drugs,
exactly right.
right? Which I think technically was as old as I think President Nixon back in the 1970s. That's how long they've been using this term. And that's kind of what you're referring to with like the punitive approach to the drug
Exactly.
trade.
Exactly. That's the framework of the war on drugs. But the war on drugs has had like different intensities and degrees because it comes from Nixon, but it is in the 2000 where the war on drugs becomes this very radical process of militarization of the country and a very aggressive approach to the cartels, but coming from a state that the Mexican state was shaped by neoliberal offensive and shaped by the emergence of the cartels and the way drugs started to be a very important part of our trade. The truth is that we trade, Mexico and the United States have a very intense drug trade that is illegal, you know? So it's in the 2000s where the war on drugs got incredibly radical, aggressive, and they decide to go after the cartels. But the Mexican state has already this particular structure where the cartels have this criminal association with the state, with sectors of the Mexican deep state, meaning the army, meaning the police. Same case with the DEA in the United States. Okay, there are multiple cases that already show that are public the involvement between DEA agents and the cartels. Because an illegal trade of drugs requires the complicity of the states. You know what I'm saying?
Totally.
So the war on drugs was like a radicalization of this process, and they went after the cartels. But the truth is that they were at the same time the government, the state was leaning into one of the cartels against the other one. You know what I'm saying? So negotiating different agreements with the cartels that it's true, in Mexico gained a lot of power, a lot of, for example, territorial control and sometimes political control of some countries and I'm sorry, towns and small cities, you know. So they started attacking some of them and helping some of them in a incredibly bloody negotiation, right? That transformed the war on drugs into a basically a war on the people, because that's the thing. The dealers, the cartels in the 70s were not killing the population, and now is a crossfire between a corrupted military and the cartels against the population. And that's the real tragedy of the Mexican war on drugs. The victims are students, young peasants, indigenous. We have more disappeared than Afghanistan victims in the whole war in Mexico. It's like a real war in that sense, you know? So, and that's all the consequences of these politics imposed by the White House that facilitated to have a militarist country that is incredibly contradictory, because the militarization hasn't put a halt on the power of the dealers, which shows how in bankruptcy is this approach, right? The other aspect that I wanted to tackle before moving forward is immigration. Immigration, and also like how the relationship between the last US administration has been with Mexico. In terms of immigration, the truth is that Obama was known by the NGOs and the community organizations that defend migrants as the great deporter. There was a massive amount of deportations during the Obama era. And then Biden continued with these politics, but it's true that in face of the so-called crisis of the border that we can problematize later, it started to have a combination of militarization, right? It was Biden who tried to pass this very aggressive bill, but the Republicans didn't allow it. But it was the Kamala Harris said in her campaign, "This is the toughest anti-immigration law we have ever passed." So they were even bragging about it. So it was incredibly aggressive, but at the same time, it's true that the Biden administration it made more flexible some legal processes for people seeking asylum at the border, etc., to get to the United States, and that's what Trump already set back. There's nothing of that institutional like network that allow people to at least submit a request or whatever is there anymore. Trump, it took a week for Trump to get rid of that, right? But it was still a very aggressive policy. And in terms of the agreement, during the Biden administration, Mexico and Biden had some tensions when AMLO was the president, before Claudia Sheinbaum, because of tariffs. Regarding tuna, for example, it's contentious because Mexican tuna is very good. No, and it has low tariffs and it does very well in America. And imperialism is all against competition. They say they are for free competition, but they are not. They are for like corporative monopoly of everything. So tuna
Totally.
is contentious. The avocado is contentious. And Biden had to put pressure on Mexico regarding the migrant crisis using tariffs. So it's not like Trump is, of course, dramatically radicalizing the rhetoric and the agenda, but it has been always a relationship between an imperialist country and a semi-colony. Okay, so and what is more like contemporary, like how this relationship reshaped with AMLO in terms of war on drugs, militarization of the border, is incredibly important because even though in many ways AMLO won the presidency because people were fed up with militarization, before AMLO won the presidency, there was a huge movement against the militarization in general in Mexico. It was massive, very democratic. Students, young people, some unions, intellectuals were part of it. And then there was like the student demanding the accountability and clarification of what happened with 43 students, indigenous students, that were kidnapped by the cartels in complicity with the military. People were fed up with the military, with the police, with like everyone like working with the cartels, but at the same time, the country completely militarized with human rights violations happening in a country also Oden that still has very high rates of femicide that didn't change with AMLO neither with Claudia so far. And it's femicide that affects the most daughters of the women, trans women of the working class. So that didn't change. But what changed is that AMLO, that didn't have control of the state, created, as a continuation of this politics of militarization, the National Guard. And he kind of like developed the same politics that the last administration, that were based on militarizing the country, you know? But at the same time, with the migrant crisis, the US was putting a lot of pressure on AMLO's government for Mexico to retain the migrants, to prevent the migrants to cross the border, as if Mexico had the infrastructure, the money, the capacity to do that. And for doing that, even a government that presents itself as progressive, that has a lot of popular support, and we can discuss that later, but the politics was also militarize the control of migration. A very strong presence of the National Guard and the military on the southern border of Mexico with Guatemala, to repress the migrants and the rest of the country. And in the context of the war on drugs, the National Guard is playing the role that the military played before. It's the same approach: criminalization, militarization, in the context of, again, a state that is deeply involved in the way the cartels have gained such a prominent position. So the current situation is delicate because Trump is going to put, and with this threat that the cartels are terrorist organizations, that justified the US eventually using the force against the terrorist organizations, it puts a lot of pressure on Claudia's government in order to negotiate with US imperialism. But the approach has been the same: militarization, criminalization. So, in terms of the imperialist subordination of Mexico, so we don't have national sovereignty. All the intelligence departments of the American state can operate freely in Mexico, for example. The way they arrested the Mayo Zambada last year, for example, is an example. The DEA and the FBI arrested the Mayo Zambada in an operation that the Mexican government didn't know about it. So there's always a bunch of violations to Mexican sovereignty coming from the US, because the agreement, a relation they have been established, is the relationship of a semi-colony. And the problem is that AMLO and Claudia don't have the agenda to, it would mean to change the structure of the relationship, to challenge these politics.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to talk about, like how the US Mexico relationship is likely to change in the coming period, since we've kind of already touched on some of these issues, like the growing militarization of the border, AMLO and Scheinbaum's complicity with the immigration policies, for example. But as we've argued, for example, on the website, Mexico in particular is going to take on kind of a new importance during the Trump administration. And we've already seen, actually, even in the first week, some of the changes that are coming up and some of the ways that the Mexican government is reacting to this presidency. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the ways in which the US Mexico relationship will likely change in this period? Why will it change, and what will this concretely look like?
Yes. So a lot that is behind, a lot that is at stake regarding the relationship that Trump is going to try to build with Mexico is marked by the fact that China is a very important threat of US hegemony internationally. In this context, Mexico and Latin America, Mexico in particular, but Latin America in general, play an incredibly important role because China has had politics towards Latin America. China does not behave like a classic imperialism at all. So it's difficult to say that it's imperialist because it has many features that say the opposite. But at the same time, it does have imperialist features. So one of those features, for example, are connected with the amount of investment that they have towards semi-colonies like Latin America. Investment and capital, no, Chinese capital flow into these countries, and of course exploiting the resources and the working class, a cheap labor force of other countries, which is a very imperialist feature, if you will. You know what I'm saying? So they do have that towards Africa, towards Latin America, and this relationship has been building up for some years now. So China had and has important business in Argentina. The Kirchner period, right, was based. Kirchner were like the Argentinian anti-neoliberal governments that came before Macri and Milei, and they prioritized the relationship with China. China also has important businesses with Brazil, Venezuela, Cuba, but now, and this is relatively new, China is having way more businesses and open negotiations with the Mexican government. And of course, as we know, because Trump made it clear on his inauguration speech about Panama, China has the control, is the second user of the Panama Canal. China has the control of two ports. And the relationship with Mexico was always, of course, inclined to prioritize the relationship with the US for sure. But at the same time, lately, China has way more investment towards Mexico. And that's definitely not a good sign for a government that is trying to focus in a way, to say it like very like shortly and schematically, Trump is trying to take care of the open conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, to focus the American army, the American state, the American government, and everything on the competition with China, the Indo-Pacific, and the equation includes Latin America. Regarding immigration, of course, as we were saying, is going to be a contentious aspect. Trump is likely or is using tariffs to put pressure on the Latin American governments to make concessions regarding immigration. And we saw that with Colombia. The Colombian president rejected a flight that came from the United States with deported people. And immediately after, Trump threatened it with tariffs. And the Colombian government had to negotiate, because that's the limit of the Latin American governments. They are capitalist governments that benefit from the relationship with imperialism. So to threaten that much that structure with Trump it's fragile for them, because all the economies, the Mexican economy in the first place, it's, as we said at the beginning, structurally dependent on U.S. economy, right? So we already saw how much Trump is gonna use millions of people as a coin bargaining to negotiate with the Latin American governments, and we will see if the tensions develop. It could always be the possible that the Latin American governments go further than they want, creating tensions, geopolitical tensions in the region. Trump has the alliance in Latin America of Javier Milei in Argentina. There's far right in Latin America as well. So having politics towards Latin America also has the intention of strengthening the far right, the Bolsonaro imaginary of Latin America that exists, right? So we will see how all this play out all together within the coming months. Regarding tariffs, neoliberalism, right, and free trade, globalization was based on the expansion of the working class, creating this working class with no rights, precarious, no union. It was based, of course, on free trade, a bunch of other things, but I wanted to highlight how important tariffs are for the way the neoliberal world was shaped. Low tariffs. Neoliberalism is not exclusively free trade, but it's very important. So Trump is threatening that aspect of the neoliberal order that is in crisis, that is dying. Sometimes it's difficult to know if it's dying or is already dead, but it's threatening that aspect. And this is incredibly contentious, not only for Mexico and Mexican capitalism, but also for US capitalism, because a bunch of sectors of American capital depend on low tariffs with Mexico to, like, for their own businesses. There's nothing, it's there's nothing that the US is losing from its partnership with Mexico. That's the big Trumpist lie of all times. I mean, no, it's not the only one, but it's part of the top 10. There's nothing that is non beneficial for the US in the relationship with Mexico. Mexico controls migration, the tariffs are low, we have a cheap labor force for the corporations, trillions of dollars like cross the border every day, every day. And as I said, is one of the most important value chains in the world. So Trump increasing tariffs with Mexico definitely is going to create two scenarios that we will see how they play out. On the one hand, it definitely increased prices in the US. It definitely does. And on the other hand, is going to affect a sector of capital that is part of the network that constitutes the USMC agreement. So how that's going to play out, we don't know yet. There is a strong opposition against tariffs among the big capital that now is supporting Trump. On the other hand, it's true that the big capital and Wall Street are kind of like kissing the ring of the king. And I was reading 2 days ago, JP Morgan already said that people should just get over it and accept that there are going to be tariffs. But what I'm trying to say is like any dramatic decision about tariffs is going to affect the global economy in ways that we might don't know yet or don't understand yet. And this is Mexico, and this is China, and this is Canada, which are the three countries that are most important in terms of like commercial relationship with the US. So this is probably the most, how do you say, subversive aspect right now of Trump's threat over its own allies, the traditional allies of the US, which is for sure already changing the rules of the geopolitics. So what we don't know is how it's going to play out, how it's going to look like, because it has structural consequences towards the global economy.
I'm curious because given everything that you said, especially at the start about the dependence on Mexico or the US's dependence on Mexico, and then also about, like, as we've talked about a lot, which is the huge threat posed by China in quote unquote, America's backyard is how Mexico's often referred to as. Do you think that Mexico will have some leverage now as part of the USMCA?
It definitely does. Politically, Trump is giving Claudia Sheinbaum a leverage to a different scale, because one of the characteristics of these first weeks of Trump's presidency is that no one is challenging him seriously. The Democrats went to inauguration day with a friendly face, shaking hands, congratulating everything as if nothing happened, so to speak. So I think, and Claudia Sheinbaum has been challenging Trump, right? And portraying herself as one of the most important regional leaders in a context where Latin America is not clear. The US had very strong alliances, for example, with Honduras, which had a very pro American government, but at the same time, Trump is already threatening that relationship. What I'm trying to say is there's a geopolitical moment in Latin America that has a lot of open questions because we don't know how the relation of forces is going to play out between its internal right wing and the so called progressive wing. The progressive wing, so to speak, that is represented by Mexico, but with an intense contradiction because a Mexican nationalism, a Latin American like anti-imperialism or nationalism will challenge, as you were saying, the structural relationship that we described at the beginning. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't create a tension between the US and Latin America, and it doesn't mean that Mexico it doesn't have leverage because of what I was saying, the way Claudia Sheinbaum has 80% of the popular support in Mexico. Trump won the election with 1.3 you know what I'm saying? So that's exclusively that is already kind of challenging. She's a woman, is challenging a little bit Trump in itself, and it projects her like a regional leader, as I said. Now, that makes her more possible to try to negotiate in better conditions because this is important to say the USMCA is going to be negotiated by 2026. Trump wants to rush the negotiations, but on my understanding, Claudia Sheinbaum and Canada are trying to slow down and to get to the negotiation until 2026. So Claudia has the possibility of Claudia Sheinbaum building up some strength towards the negotiation. Why? Because a sector of American capital benefits from the relationship with Mexico. I'm talking about the big food industry, for example, that is American. It has American capital, Goya, and all those. Not to speak the impact that the Mexican labor force has on agriculture. The Wall Street Journal, that is, uh, as we know, a pro-imperialist, pro-capitalist newspaper, was already warning about the consequences of the immigration politics towards Mexican in particulars that are part of the labor force in the countryside. So yes, Claudia Sheinbaum definitely is going to have some leverage for sure to negotiate. Also, there's an aspect that if Trump wants Sheinbaum to collaborate with the migratory policy, and that's why it's monster, is outrageous to me. But yeah, that's why he's using tariffs as a way to negotiate. For example, regarding the Colombia agreement, Claudia Sheinbaum said yesterday that she agreed the way that they resolved the conflict. But it's awful the way they resolved the conflict because Colombia had to like knee themselves down, or how you put themselves down.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Sheinbaum's popularity kind of leads me to a question I've been having, which is, obviously a big reason we're talking about Mexico and the U.S. Mexico relationship is because of the new Trump administration, and as you've highlighted, also, I mean the implications even for the global economy. But something that's also really interesting about Mexico is because of Scheinbaum's popularity, because of Morena, which is the party she leads, which was previously led by AMLO, her predecessor. And, a statistic that really stuck out to me that I'm sure a lot of people, the listeners, have heard is that 2024 was the year with the most elections in all of global history, basically. And Morena was one of the very few incumbent parties in 2024 that actually gained popularity, that actually won elections against the opposition. And, obviously, this is sure just an interesting fact, but also more importantly, a lot of leftists, like a lot of US socialists, even see Morena, see AMLO and Scheinbaum as very progressive. I mean, I think there is a lot of kind of idealization of Scheinbaum, especially because, like, she's a woman. She has had very progressive politics in her, well, currently and in her past. So leftists are kind of saying strategically, like, we should look at Morena, we should look at Scheinbaum as an example of how we should organize politically. Like, this is an example of, like, a good sort of leftist leader, if I can put it a little bit simply. So, my question is, what do you think of this? Like, is Morena, is Scheinbaum a leftist? Why is this party so popular in Mexico?
Yes, it's incredibly important to understand. I think Morena's rise and popularity, we definitely have to understand where we came from in Mexico, because people have to be aware that we came from almost a century of a single party rule, no democracy, not even voting. And then we came from two administrations of the right wing opposition, both countries with an agenda that subordinated Mexico in extremely to US mandate and economy. Mexico was incredibly important for the US to put forward the neoliberal offensive. So we came from a historical period where there was no democracy in Mexico. There was a lot of repression against unionists, activists, journalists, and then we had the militarization, rates of femicide that are just like outrageous, a very intense persecution of human rights, of environmentalists. Imagine, Oden, that 43 students were just kidnapped and murdered with the complicity of a branch of the state
Yeah.
by the cartels. So people were incredibly fed up, and Morena took advantage of the big, big, big struggles including the struggle for accountability and accusing the state for the disappearance of the 43 students of Ayotzinapa, which is the name of the town that they were from. But also there was a democratic movement for the government to respect the voting in 2014, the 132 movement. Before AMLO, there was a huge process of class struggle and, very important, an organic crisis, like in the US, meaning a rupture between the people and the traditional parties. And if you think about it, Morena is a new party, as you said. The traditional parties almost disappeared after Ayotzinapa and after this struggle, almost disappeared because the masses were fed up, were like, this is enough. So, in order for the Mexican regime to survive, what do I mean to survive? To survive in terms of the relationship with the United States, that wasn't in question, and politically, like, prevent that the regime was overthrown by the masses. To be honest, though, that, like, we didn't have like a revolution in Mexico, or nothing close like a revolution, but it was so tense. People were so fed up. These people were identified as murderers of the working class, of the people. A lot of hatred. So the regime, in order to survive, had the capacity to give space to the formation of a new political party, the Morena, that has a grassroots component. Now, if you evaluate objectively Morena from the perspective of its agenda, is definitely not an super left progressive. Is definitely not. It's very refreshing having a government that, for example, inform the population what they're going to do, having a government that talk about the poor people, after governments that were also incredibly racist, also, you know what I'm saying, incredibly misogynistic. Having a woman as a president in Mexico is just, I thought we were not going to see that, to be quite honest. So all of that is refreshing, and the Morena definitely has an agenda of a lot of social programs to alleviate some necessities that have created some superficial relief. For example, they increased the living wage in more than 100%. But the thing is, imagine how low was the salary in Mexico before, and this salary does not apply to a working class that is incredibly diverse, spread out, and precarious. So it's not all the sectors of the population. So yes, but is money that is not changing the structural problems of Mexico that come from the intensity of imperialist penetration. So nor Morena, nor AMLO, nor Claudia Sheinbaum, they don't question that aspect that is at the roots of all our diseases in Mexico. We have imperialist disease in Mexico, and that would mean to change the structure. And that's why Morena and Claudia have been incapable to stop the war on drugs and the social forces and problems that come with the war on drugs, the cartels, the violence, because it's a structural problem. AMLO wasn't able, for example, to get into trial the political responsibles of Ayotzinapa. Garcia Luna was chief of the military that was involved in the Ayotzinapa case and other cases of human rights violations. He was brought to the US to go into trial, and Mexico, AMLO, demanded the expatriation because he didn't want Garcia Luna to be tried. What does that mean? It means that that sector of the ruling class, the Garcia Luna, the political responsibles of Ayotzinapa, are not going to be touched, because that would mean to change the structure as well. So it's incredibly understandable the popularity that AMLO and Claudia have. It's very important to understand the Mexican tragedy, because we came from years of a lot of suffering. Now, is this a government that is going to challenge U.S. imperialist oppression, change the life structurally of the working class, which would mean to have a fight with the capitalists, to expropriate, to stop the dispossession of the corporations in the countryside, etc., etc. It would mean to dramatically change Mexico. And for that, you need the working class, which is the last problem that I want to talk about Morena. The Morena government, the Claudia government, is not a government based on self organization. One of the problems of the last period is that the masses and the working class have been demobilized. So we're lacking, I think, among the Mexican left, class independence for the working class and the peasantry to organize independently for a government that might put forward reforms or things that we might support, but they are not going to change the structure that exploit and oppresses us. So we have to organize ourselves independently and then against a government that is fostering illusions. That, for example, the UCMCA can be beneficial for Mexico, is beneficial for Mexican capital.
Yeah, so you've made really clear, I think, that liberation for like the Mexican working class and oppressed is not going to come from Morena, which, as you pointed out, is definitely not, a government based on, the independent self organization of the working class or anything like that. And I think you've pointed out the fact that ultimately, Scheinbaum, for example, supports multinational companies. Neither she nor AMLO nor anyone in Morena is advocating for a dismantling of the system that keeps Mexico oppressed and subordinated relative to the United States. So, what would you say, though, then, is the task for the Mexican working class and the US working class? And can you touch a little bit also on the importance of having a really anti imperialist and internationalist perspective here?
I think this is a question that has a lot of weight and is incredibly important in the context of how Trump is, in a way, representing a challenge of the globalization, of the neoliberal integration that we saw in the case of North America, Mexico, the US, and Canada, right? He's threatening that, saying that it was unfair and bad for the conditions of living of the American working class, right? So he's threatening with incredibly like reactionary politics, like militarizing the border, like criminalizing migrants. And then the Latin American governments have had always the approach of trying to negotiate. Sometimes they confront US imperialism more, sometimes they negotiate and they subordinate themselves, but always in the context of the, honestly, the doctrine Monroe. It was over, of course. I'm saying like metaphorically, what well, that's why Trump, in his inauguration speech, said the manifest destiny of the US. It had that Monroe nostalgia about Latin America because they definitely consider that Latin America is the backyard of US imperialism. So he's threatening the neoliberal integration that was presented as a way to move forward. In neoliberalism is what's going to bring wealthy for everyone, right? And it wasn't true. It wasn't true for the American working class, and it wasn't true for the Mexican working class that is extremely exploited by US corporations. So the working class, the left, we need to present an alternative to the neoliberal imperialist integration of the NAFTA and the isolationist, imperialist, chauvinistic approach of Donald Trump. Because what is true is that our working class, from Canada to Central America, Oden, we are connected by the value chains. We are the engines, we're the fuel, we're the heart that makes this big value change moving. So we have to think about the integration in our terms, in the terms of the working class. We are integrated in many ways, Oden. The American working class and the Mexican working class has a common history. Since the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican anarchists were already going back and forth, organizing the American workers and the Mexican workers to work together. There was a beautiful Mexican strike in 1906 before the Mexican Revolution, the Cananea strike, led by anarchists that organized American and Mexican workers at the border. So we share a class struggle tradition and a class struggle history that we had to recuperate. So we need to start thinking our integration. Our integration, because what is coming is a huge chauvinist wave in the US that is going to affect the working class. Because unfortunately, Trump has convinced the working class in America that the problems are the migrants and the Mexicans and the relocation of the companies towards Mexico, right? They have been convinced about that. So the task of the Mexican working class is to fight that chauvinism, right? Showing a path of unity that has to lead the American working class, in particular right now, the politicized sectors of the American working class, because there's a new generation unionizing. There's a new generation trying to put forward statements in solidarity with Palestine. This generation cannot fall into the chauvinism of the American working class. It's our worst cancer within the working class. Sinn Féin, for example, which is the leader of the UAW, just said one day before the inauguration that he was going to support the protectionist agenda of Donald Trump. Protectionism, it means resolving the crisis, leaning on the backs of the Mexican workers to reinforce this idea among the American workers that their problems come from the Mexican workers. So we have to fight every single aspect: immigration, tariffs, and the Mexican working class has the opportunity to drag the American working class into that fight.
I think that's a powerful place to end it. Jimena, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Oden, for having me. Very happy to have had this conversation.